If you do any prospecting with LinkedIn, you have got to go get set up with Surf. That's SURFE. It's a tool you can use to add new contacts to your CRM system directly from LinkedIn in seconds. I'm using it every single day. I add contacts, follow my deals, keep track of notes, and it ends up saving me a bunch of time on prospecting and outreach, which means I can spend more time moving my deals along. The data is always 100% accurate since I don't have to copy and paste all the fields over from each and every contact that I want to put in my CRM. Instead, Surf does that all automatically with just one click in about 60 seconds. The team over at Surf has put together a very special offer for fans of sales players. There's a link down in the show notes, and you can use the promo code JWSurf5. Don't forget the E at the end of Surf. That's JWSurf5 for 5% off your first year. Don't spend another minute doing things manually. Go get set up with Surf.
Hey everyone, happy Friday. The inspiration for today's episode comes from Noah Kagan. Noah Kagan runs a podcast called Noah Kagan Presents. He's the founder of AppSumo, and he runs a blog called OK Dork. He's been writing about internet marketing, e-commerce, and entrepreneurship for over a decade now. And I've been following him for a long time. He lives in Austin, so I had a chance to actually talk with him on the phone at one point. Very, very solid guy. And he put together an episode recently on his podcast called 7 Books That Changed My Life. And I wanted to do something similar. So I have a list here, which is the top 10 business books that changed my career and life. And so I'm going to start with each book, who wrote it, and then just a short why it was so influential and what some of my takeaways were from reading the book. So let's get started here. Number 10 on my list, I'm going to work backwards, by the way. Number 10 is Measure What Matters by John Doerr, and Doerr is spelled Doerr. Why was this such an influential book? Well, for anyone who's interested in learning how to set goals and achieve those goals, this is the gold standard. John Doerr is a VC. He lives in the Silicon Valley. I believe he was an early investor in Google and a handful of other very successful technology companies. And Measure What Matters is the walkthrough or his outline of his methodology called OKRs. If you work in tech, eventually you're going to work somewhere where they implement OKRs, or where you'll have to pick and set OKRs. And OKR stands for Objective and Key Result. So it's a really great book if you want to learn how to set your objectives and then measure the actual effectiveness of those goals. And he weaves in, interesting case studies from Google and other tech companies that he's worked with. I think there's a story about how Bono implemented OKRs, Bono from YouTube. So it's kind of interesting. And again, if you read this book and then you end up working for a company that uses OKRs, you're going to be several chapters ahead of everybody else on your team. So I highly recommend Measure What Matters by John Doerr. So number 9 is High Output Management by Andy Grove. Why a management book? So as a seller, I'm often selling to managers and leaders. And I read this book because I wanted to understand how some of the greatest managers think about production, process, and people. And Andy Grove is really a wizard in that sense. So Andy Grove, if you don't know who that is, he led Intel through, I believe, like the 80s, maybe the early 90s. He's a huge management expert and thinker. He's written several books on the topic, and high output management is really one of the standard works for anyone who works in high tech, especially on the leadership side. If you hear, if you ever listen to like the A16Z podcast, or you hear interviews or read interviews from other tech leaders and VCs, a lot of times they recommend high output management to the founders in their portfolio. So what was great about this book is there's tons of really cool object lessons. It's really just almost a 101 on how to, again, manage people, build a repeatable process, work on scale. Andy's really a genius, or was really a genius. So I highly recommend, if you're selling to business people and selling to executives, that you check out High Output Management. It's a pretty short book, but it's dense. It has a lot of material and content in it. So that's High Output Management. Number 8 on the list is Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson. This book is awesome, and for a few reasons. One, it gave me a lot of background information on the tech industry Apple was influential in the growth of our modern tech industry because of the production of the Apple computers, the Lisa 2 and some of those machines. Steve Jobs is one of the most brilliant business people of our time, both in terms of technology and sales and marketing. And while the book doesn't focus specifically on tactics for selling, it does have a lot of really great stories about building innovation, business. Steve himself was, of course, a very eccentric individual, so it's extremely entertaining. But after I read this book, I had a really good understanding of where tech came from, and it helped me with terminology internally. I understood what things like a graphical user interface are because you learn about where that came from and why it's important. So I highly recommend reading this book. It's incredibly long. I listened to it on Audible, and it took me several weeks, probably just in small segments. I was listening to it via my commute at the time. So if you read the hard copy, it's going to take you a really long time to get through. It's going to be, quite long. Even listening to it, it was several hours, but I highly recommend it. It's worthwhile reading in your career, and it's going to help you understand the tech industry at a whole nother level. Number 7, The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz. So if you're not familiar with who Ben is, he is the co-founder of A16Z, or Andreessen Horowitz, a big venture capitalist firm in the Bay Area. And this is probably the best book that I've ever read on leadership and doing the hard things in life and in business. He tells his story about his career and some of the, frankly, challenges that he encountered as an entrepreneur. So he was the CEO of Opsware, or LoudCloud, I think is what it was called, an early pioneer in cloud computing, or SaaS. And he had some crazy ups and downs in that business. He had some personal challenges in his family. And the book outlines all of those different experiences while also weaving in a bunch of lessons about how to manage your career, how to manage hard situations in business, and how to push through and be successful. So, very great book. One of the other interesting parts about this one is that he incorporates a bunch of quotes from rappers and hip hop artists, which I think is kind of unique. Apparently, Mr. Horowitz is a very big fan of that genre of music. So I thought that was kind of a cool touch. Highly recommend The Hard Thing About Hard Things. Number 6, Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. Now, again, not technically a sales book, certainly not a SaaS sales book, but a very important business and self-help book. And I think it was one of the first of its kind. I think some people say it was the first, quote unquote, self-help book. Napoleon Hill wrote it apparently during or shortly after the Great Depression. Yes, the Great Depression, not recession. It's a very old work. And in some cases, some of the principles might sound a little dated. Some of the terminology might sound a little bit dated, but it's super interesting and worth reading. Napoleon Hill spent a bunch of time with some of the Gilded Age entrepreneurs like Andrew Carnegie, Henry Ford, J.P. Morgan, and whoever else. I think he spent a bunch of time with all of these great entrepreneurs of their time, and he documented some of their habits, their mindsets, and how they thought about building a business and scaling a business. So it's a very interesting read. Again, it's kind of old. There is something at the end that's a little weird. I'm not going to share it because I don't want to spoil the ending for you. Push through, read the book. Yes, he has a couple of really weird practices that I won't get into, but I think it's still worth reading and it's still worth understanding if you want to improve your mindset, plan ahead, and set yourself up for success in life in terms of your riches, your career, and just ultimately finding success in your life. Number 5, The Sales Development Playbook by Trish Bertuzzi. I love this book, and I think it's really underrated. It's very specific to someone who wants to build a go-to-market business or a go-to-market process, pipeline development or generation process. And I think it's a really great book to read if you're an SDR or early on in your career and looking to build pipeline. Trish is amazing. And the book walks through some very actionable tips for how to write great emails, how to cold call, how to build a process that's repeatable, and how to understand crafting a message to your prospects and your customers and being able to put together who the ideal profile is for who you're selling to. So I read this when I was at a startup and I was working on building out the demand generation and pipeline generation process. And it really left an impression on me and helped me approach that project with a lot more credibility and a lot more ideas for how to make it successful. Number 4 is Selling Above and Below the Line by Skip Miller. So this is one I recently read, and it was a complete, mind fuck is the word I want to use. because it reshaped the way that I think about doing enterprise level SaaS deals. Skip goes through the difference between above the line and below the line, which at the highest level, above the line is when you're selling to a senior level executive decision maker versus selling below the line, which is to a manager or frontline user. So the book is just filled with incredibly actionable advice on how to speak the language of executives while simultaneously working with your champion who's below the line to move large enterprise deals along. Skip is an amazing person. There's lots of his trainings out there. I recommend following him and connecting with him on LinkedIn because he really is a great sales thinker of our time. Number 3, From Impossible to Inevitable, which is written by Aaron Ross and Jason Lemkin. Aaron Ross was the author of Predictable Revenue, and he was an early sales leader at Salesforce. He sort of standardized the model for sales development representatives. So when we think about an SDR in our time, a lot of that can be owed to Aaron Ross's model and the book he wrote, Predictable Revenue. Jason Lemkin owns SaaStr, and he's done a bunch of successful SaaS companies in the past, as well as been a VC in several successful firms. And SaaStr, he writes a lot on SaaStr. It's a blog. He tweets a lot, and he's pretty active on LinkedIn as well. So both of these guys speak very specifically to the ins and outs of building a successful SaaS company. And the book focuses, for the most part, on the go-to-market and revenue generation side. It also talks about nurturing customers and building other elements of the business. But after I read this, I had a really clear understanding of what successful SaaS founders do to build great companies. And it's helped me in my career, again, have a lot more insight into the process and where I fit into that process as a SaaS seller. So that's From Impossible to Inevitable. You should also check out Predictable Revenue, which is Aaron Ross's work. And then please go subscribe to SaaStr or follow Jason Lemkin on Twitter. Number 2, The 4-Hour Workweek by Tim Ferris. I am a big Tim Ferris fan. He's one of the reasons that I do the podcast. I've actually met Tim in Austin on 2 occasions. So I listen to his podcast religiously, but where I first heard about him was from the book, The 4-Hour Workweek. And I picked this up almost 10 years ago. And I remember reading this and just getting chills from the content in this book. And again, it's not a sales book. It's not specific to SaaS. It's more of a mindset and self-help book, but it changed the way that I think about managing my time. It changed the way I think about setting goals, and it changed the way that I think about what I want out of life. I think Tim is in a lot of ways like a modern day Henry David Thoreau. I think he's a great philosopher, and the ideas in the book can be implemented in a sales career, but they've also just helped me enrich my life more. So I highly recommend The 4-Hour Workweek. He talks in the book about how he started himself in tech sales, but that he quickly started an e-commerce company as a side hustle, or a muse as he calls it, and generated multiple streams of income. And there's some hacks in there on how you can manage difficult colleagues, how you can plan your time. It's kind of funny in 2021 to think about how there's a whole section of the book about being able to work from home and persuading your management team to let you work remotely. Nowadays, it's probably not too hard to persuade anyone to let you work from home. So still a very interesting book, a lot of great insights in there, and just a complete classic. Go check it out. Now, last but certainly not least, Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. I've talked about this book before on the show, and I'll talk about it again. This is one that I reread every single year. Why? So Chris Voss was an FBI hostage negotiator, and I think he was part of their New York bureau. In this book, he gets into stories around specific hostage negotiations that he dealt with, but also how they can apply to business and life. And since negotiation is a big part of being a sales rep, this book is a must read for every modern seller out there. It's going to give you specific ideas for how you can be more persuasive in your emails, how you can use language and human psychology to aid you in your negotiations. Chris built the playbook that the FBI now uses for hostage negotiations. But again, all of this is very applicable to business and sales as well. So that's it, guys. That's my 10 business books that changed my life and career. I hope you'll check some of these out. And if you do end up reading some of these, reach out. I'd love to hear about it. Thanks for listening.